Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately. He simply stood there in the center of the vast living room, the quiet stretching longer than anyone expected. The late afternoon light through the tall windows painted long golden stripes across the marble floor, and in that stillness Daniel slowly adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy jacket, as if the movement helped him think. He looked first at Grace, then at the young woman behind her. Sarah Bennett looked completely out of place inside the Whitmore estate. Her shoes were dusty from the long walk up the driveway, and her coat still carried the faint chill of the early fall air outside. Daniel noticed those details automatically. He always noticed details. That was one of the habits that built his empire. Yet the detail he could not place was the calm certainty in Grace's voice. In 12 years, she had never interrupted him. She had never challenged him. She had never spoken with that quiet confidence. Daniel took a slow breath. "Grace," he said evenly, "you have worked in this house for a long time. You know I value honesty and discipline. So I will ask you once. Why are you standing between me and a stranger who claims to know something about my family?" Grace folded her hands gently in front of her apron, her posture respectful but steady. She did not look frightened. Instead, she looked like someone who had waited a very long time for this moment to arrive. "Because, sir," she answered softly, "sometimes the truth arrives in a way that makes people uncomfortable." Daniel's eyes shifted towards Sarah again. The young woman swallowed and opened her purse with careful hands. From inside, she pulled out a small photograph protected by a clear sleeve. The edges of the picture were worn as though it had been carried for many years. Sarah held it out, but did not step closer yet. "I did not come here to cause trouble," she said quietly. "I came because someone asked me to find you." Daniel did not take the photograph immediately. Instead, he studied her face. There was something about the way she spoke, something sincere that did not match the usual stories people invented when they wanted money or attention from powerful men. "Who asked you to find me?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, then answered in a voice barely above a whisper, "Your mother." The room seemed to tighten around the words. A faint shift passed through the staff standing along the wall, but no one dared react openly. Daniel's expression did not change, yet his eyes sharpened. "My mother," he repeated slowly. "My mother died 38 years ago in a hospital in Boston." Grace lowered her gaze for a moment, then lifted it again. "That is the story you were given," she said carefully. Daniel finally reached out and took the photograph from Sarah's hand. The glossy paper felt cool against his fingers. He looked down at the image. A young woman stood beside a hospital bed, smiling softly at the camera. The picture was old but clear enough to reveal familiar features. The curve of the cheek, the shape of the eyes. Daniel felt something small and unexpected stir in the back of his memory. He had seen that face somewhere before. Not in a photograph. In a mirror. His grip on the photograph tightened slightly as the quiet inside the mansion deepened. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Sarah answered without hesitation. "From the woman who has been waiting 30 years to tell you the truth." Daniel Whitmore did not lift his eyes from the photograph for several long seconds. The silence in the room stretched until it felt almost tangible, like a thin sheet of glass suspended between everyone present. The woman in the picture looked no older than her mid-20s. Her hair was tied loosely behind her head, and she stood beside a hospital bed with a soft smile that carried a quiet kind of warmth. Daniel studied every detail, every shadow in the image, every line of the woman's face. Something about it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. His mind, trained for years to analyze contracts, negotiations, and numbers, began searching through distant memories that were not really memories at all but fragments of stories he had been told growing up. His father had always spoken about Daniel's mother with a tone that sounded respectful but distant, as though describing someone who belonged more to history than to family. "She died when you were born," his father would say. It was a tragedy, but life moves forward. Daniel had accepted that explanation the way most children accepted facts about the world they could not verify. Now the photograph trembled slightly between his fingers. He lifted his gaze slowly towards Sarah Bennett. She stood quietly near the doorway, her shoulders drawn inward as if she understood the gravity of the moment but did not want to push it further. Grace Coleman remained standing beside her, calm and steady like an anchor in the center of the room. Daniel spoke carefully, his voice quieter than before. "If this photograph is meant to prove something, it does not yet prove anything. Anyone can find an old picture. Sarah nodded quickly as if she expected the response. I understand that, she said. That is why I brought more than a photograph. She reached into her purse again and removed a small envelope, the paper slightly yellowed with age. She held it out toward him with both hands. Daniel hesitated for a moment before taking it. The envelope was addressed in elegant handwriting. His name was written across the front in ink that had faded slightly over time. Daniel Whitmore. The sight of his name written by someone who clearly expected him to read it many years later created a strange tightening in his chest. Who wrote this? He asked. Sarah answered quietly. The woman in the photograph. Daniel's fingers traced the edges of the envelope. He noticed the faint scent of old paper, the kind that came from something that had been stored carefully for a long time. Grace watched him without speaking. Daniel glanced toward her briefly. You said the story I was told is not the whole truth, he said. Grace nodded once. Yes, sir. Daniel looked back at the envelope, then slowly broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter written on line stationery. The handwriting matched the name on the front. He unfolded the paper carefully, and his eyes moved across the first line. The room remained completely silent as he read the opening words. My dear Daniel, if you are reading this letter, it means someone has finally been brave enough to tell you what happened the night you were born. Daniel stopped reading. His eyes lifted slowly from the page, the calm certainty that had defined him for decades beginning to shift in a way he could not yet control. He looked again at the photograph in his other hand, then at Sarah, then finally at Grace. The quiet inside the Whitmore mansion deepened even further as a new thought formed in his mind, one that had never existed before this moment. What if the story he had lived with for 38 years was never the real one at all? Daniel Whitmore remained standing in the center of the living room, the letter still open in his hands. The words on the page seemed simple enough, yet each line carried a weight that pressed against decades of certainty he had never questioned. The quiet inside the mansion felt heavier now. Outside the tall windows, the sun had begun to dip lower toward the trees at the edge of the Whitmore property, casting long amber light across the marble floor. Daniel slowly continued reading. My dear Daniel, if you are reading this letter, it means someone has finally been brave enough to tell you what happened the night you were born. For many years I believed you would never know the truth. I was told you would grow up believing I had died. I was told that was the only way you could have the life your father wanted for you. Daniel stopped again. His eyes lifted slightly as the meaning of those lines settled in his mind. He had spent his entire life hearing the same explanation. His mother had died giving birth to him. It was a tragic story, one that had shaped how people spoke to him about family, about sacrifice, about the past. Yet this letter suggested something completely different. Daniel lowered the paper slightly and looked towards Sarah Bennett. She stood quietly, her hands clasped together in front of her, as though she were trying not to disturb the fragile moment unfolding in front of her. Grace Coleman remained beside her, calm and composed, but her eyes carried a quiet seriousness that Daniel had never noticed before. Daniel returned his gaze to the letter. The handwriting continued in steady lines across the page. I never stopped thinking about you. Not one day, but there were people who believed it was better for you to grow up without me. They said I was not the kind of woman who belonged in the world your father was building. They said I would only complicate your future. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly as he read the words. The letter did not sound angry. It did not sound bitter. It sounded patient, almost gentle, like someone explaining a painful truth without wanting to cause harm. He turned the page slowly and continued reading. For many years I respected their decision because I believed you were happy. I believed you had everything you needed. But time has a way of changing what silence can protect. If this letter has reached you, it means the truth can no longer remain hidden. Daniel lowered the letter completely now. His eyes moved from the page to the photograph again. The young woman in the image seemed almost alive in the fading light. Her calm smile carrying a quiet familiarity Daniel could no longer ignore. His voice was quieter than before when he spoke. This letter says someone made the decision to keep her away from me, he said slowly. Sarah nodded once. Yes. Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly. And you are telling me that woman is still alive. Sarah hesitated only briefly before answering. Yes. The word hung in the air like a fragile piece of truth waiting to be accepted or rejected. Daniel looked toward Grace then. You said the story I was given was not the whole truth, he said. Grace met his gaze without hesitation. That is correct, sir. Daniel studied her carefully. For 12 years, she had been part of the quiet rhythm of the Whitmore household, someone who moved through the background unnoticed. Yet now she stood at the center of something that threatened to rewrite the foundation of his life. Daniel folded the letter slowly and held it beside the photograph. His voice remained calm, but something inside it had shifted. If what you are saying is true, he said, then someone lied to me for 38 years. The room remained silent as the weight of that realization settled into the space around them. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless for several seconds after speaking those words. The realization hung in the air like a weight no one in the room quite knew how to touch. Someone lied to me for 38 years. The sentence echoed quietly through his mind as he looked again at the letter in his hand. The handwriting on the page felt strangely personal now, as though the woman who wrote it had known exactly how long it might take for the truth to reach him. The late afternoon light had softened further, filling the enormous living room, with a warm glow that made the polished marble floor shine like still water. Yet the warmth of the light did nothing to ease the tension spreading through Daniel's chest. He had spent his entire life building certainty. Every company he founded, every decision he made, every investment he approved had followed a pattern of careful logic. Facts led to conclusions. Evidence led to action. That was the system that had built Whitmore Dynamics into a company worth billions of dollars. But the moment unfolding in front of him did not follow that system. It felt like a door opening into a past he had never examined closely enough to question. Daniel slowly placed the photograph and the folded letter onto the long glass table beside him. The soft sound of paper touching the surface seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. He looked towards Sarah Bennett again. Her posture had not changed. She still stood near the doorway, as if unsure whether she had the right to move any closer into the world she had just disrupted. Daniel studied her carefully. There was something earnest in the way she carried herself, something that did not resemble the rehearsed confidence of someone trying to manipulate a wealthy stranger. You said someone asked you to find me, Daniel said finally. Sarah nodded gently. Yes. The woman who wrote this letter. Yes. Daniel folded his arms slowly, the movement deliberate, controlled. Then tell me something that proves this story is more than a letter and a photograph. Sarah hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because she seemed to understand the gravity of what she was about to say. She told me things about you that no stranger could know, Sarah said quietly. Daniel's expression remained composed. Such as, Sarah drew a slow breath. She told me that when you were born, the hospital placed a small silver bracelet on your wrist with your name engraved on it. Daniel Whitmore. She said you kept it for years even after it no longer fit. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. The detail struck him immediately because it was true. The bracelet had been kept in a small wooden box in his study for decades. It was one of the few items from his earliest days that had survived the many moves and changes of his childhood. Very few people even knew it existed. Daniel glanced briefly toward Grace Coleman. She watched quietly, her expression calm but thoughtful. Daniel turned back to Sarah. Continue, he said. Sarah nodded again. She also told me that your favorite place in the house when you were a child was the sunroom in your father's first home in Boston. She said you used to sit by the window and watch the snow fall for hours. Daniel felt another subtle shift inside his memory. The image appeared clearly now. A wide window, snow falling across the garden. The quiet comfort of sitting there alone as a child. He had never spoken publicly about those memories. The room seemed even quieter now as Daniel slowly looked down at the photograph once more. The woman in the image looked back at him with the same gentle expression. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore allowed a possibility to form that had never existed before. The possibility that the woman he had believed dead for nearly 4 decades might still be somewhere in the world waiting for him to learn the truth. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside the glass table, his eyes still resting on the photograph, as though it might reveal something new if he looked at it long enough. The room had grown noticeably quieter, the kind of quiet that made every small movement sound important. Outside, the sun had dipped lower behind the line of oak trees surrounding the Whitmore estate, and the golden light now carried a faint hint of evening. Daniel slowly lifted the photograph again, studying the woman's face with greater attention than before. The longer he looked, the harder it became to dismiss the strange familiarity in her expression. It was not only the shape of her eyes or the curve of her smile. It was something deeper, something that stirred a subtle recognition in his mind. He finally looked up again towards Sarah Bennett. "If she asked you to find me," he said calmly, "then she must have known where I was all these years." Sarah nodded slightly. "Yes, she did." Daniel's brow tightened just a little. "Then why wait 38 years to send a message like this?" Sarah lowered her gaze for a moment before answering. "Because she believed you had chosen not to know her." The words landed gently, but carried surprising weight. Daniel did not respond immediately. He had never imagined such a possibility, yet now that the idea existed, it raised an uncomfortable question. What if someone had convinced his mother that he did not want to see her? Daniel's mind began moving through the fragments of his past again. His father had rarely spoken about the years immediately after Daniel's birth. Conversations about that time were usually brief, followed by a quiet shift to another subject. At the time, Daniel had assumed it was simply grief. Now he was no longer certain. Daniel placed the photograph back on the table and picked up the letter again. His eyes scanned the lines he had not yet read. "My dear Daniel, if you ever wonder why I did not come to you sooner, please understand that there were many years when I believed I was protecting you by staying away. I was told you had a life that would be easier without my presence. I believed those words because I wanted you to have every opportunity in the world." Daniel felt a subtle tightening in his chest again. The tone of the letter carried no accusation. It sounded almost apologetic, as though the woman who wrote it still worried about causing him difficulty even after all these years. Daniel lowered the page slowly. His voice remained steady but quieter than before. "Where is she now?" Sarah answered carefully. "She is still in Boston." Daniel's eyes lifted sharply. Boston was the city where he had been born, the city his father had left shortly after Daniel's childhood began. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. Grace Coleman spoke for the first time in several minutes, her voice calm and respectful. "Sir, there is something else you should know." Daniel turned toward her slightly. "Go on." Grace hesitated briefly, as if choosing her words with care. "The woman who wrote that letter has been ill for some time. She asked Sarah to find you because she did not know how much longer she would be able to wait." The room fell silent again. Daniel looked once more at the photograph on the table. The gentle smile of the woman in the picture now carried a new meaning. For 38 years, he had believed that face belonged to someone lost forever. Now he was beginning to understand that the truth might be something very different, and that the time left to uncover it might be far shorter than he ever expected. Daniel Whitmore did not move for several seconds after Grace finished speaking. The quiet in the room felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were listening to the truth slowly unfolding inside the Whitmore estate. The photograph remained on the glass table where he had placed it, the young woman's gentle smile still illuminated by the fading evening light. Daniel looked at it again, but this time he did not study it like a stranger examining evidence. He looked at it the way someone studies a piece of his own past that had been hidden from him for too long. Boston. The name of the city echoed quietly through his thoughts. That was where his life had begun. His earliest memories were tied to a brownstone house not far from the Charles River, a place his father sold when Daniel was still a child. Daniel could still remember the long winters, the pale morning sunlight through frost on the windows, and the quiet streets that seemed to sleep under layers of snow. For years those memories had felt simple and distant, like scenes from a childhood that no longer mattered. Now those same memories seemed to hold questions he had never thought to ask. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice calm but lower than before. "You said she has been ill." Grace nodded gently. "Yes, sir." Daniel folded his arms slowly, a familiar gesture he used whenever he was thinking through a difficult situation. Yet this situation was unlike anything he had faced in a boardroom or a negotiation. Business decisions could be measured with numbers and facts. This moment was something else entirely. "How long has she been waiting for me to know the truth?" Daniel asked quietly. Sarah Bennett answered carefully. "She said she wrote the letter almost 15 years ago." Daniel's eyes shifted toward the envelope on the table. 15 years. That meant the letter had existed for nearly half the time he had spent building his company, traveling the world, giving interviews, and speaking publicly about a mother he believed had died the day he was born. Daniel felt a strange mixture of disbelief and quiet regret settle in his chest. "Why did it take this long to reach me?" he asked. Sarah lowered her voice slightly, as though the answer required a certain respect, because until recently she believed you would never want to hear it. Daniel looked toward Grace then. Her presence in the room suddenly carried more significance than it had only minutes earlier. You said earlier that the story I was given was incomplete, Daniel said slowly. Grace met his gaze with the same steady calm she had shown since the moment she stepped between him and Sarah. Yes, sir. Daniel studied her carefully. For 12 years, she had worked quietly in his home, moving through hallways and rooms as part of the daily rhythm of the household. Yet now she stood at the center of a truth that reached back to the night he was born. Grace, Daniel said, his voice measured, how do you know any of this? The question hung in the air like a door opening to another hidden layer of the story. Grace did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at the photograph on the table, then back at Daniel. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a calm certainty that seemed to steady the room itself. Because, sir, she said softly, I was there the night you were born. The words settled over the room with quiet force. And for the first time since the conversation began, Daniel Whitmore felt the ground beneath his certainty shift in a way he could not easily control. The words remained suspended in the quiet air of the Whitmore living room long after Grace Coleman spoke them. Because I was there the night you were born. Daniel Whitmore did not react immediately. For a man who had built his reputation on quick decisions and precise judgment, the moment stretched longer than anyone in the room expected. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase filled the silence like a slow heartbeat. Daniel finally turned his head toward Grace, studying her with a level of attention he had never given her before. For more than a decade, she had been part of the background of his home, someone who quietly polished railings, cleaned windows, and ensured every corner of the estate looked perfect before guests arrived. Yet now he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. You were there, Daniel repeated slowly. Grace nodded once. Her expression did not carry drama or exaggeration. It carried the calm weight of memory. Yes, sir. Daniel glanced briefly toward the photograph on the table and then back to her again. Explain that. Grace folded her hands lightly in front of her apron, her voice steady as she spoke. 38 years ago, I was a trainee nurse at St. Matthew's Hospital in Boston. I was still finishing my certification hours. That night your mother was admitted there. Daniel felt his attention sharpen immediately. St. Matthew's Hospital. The name stirred a distant echo in his memory. He had heard it once or twice growing up when older relatives mentioned the circumstances of his birth. Grace continued carefully, as though she understood the importance of each detail. Your mother arrived late in the evening. She was calm, even though the delivery had started earlier than expected. I remember that very clearly because most patients were frightened in that situation, but she kept asking the staff the same question. Daniel's voice came out quieter than he intended. What question? Grace looked directly at him. She kept asking if the baby was healthy. The words landed with a simple sincerity that seemed to soften the tension in the room for a moment. Daniel looked down at his hands unconsciously, as if imagining the moment she described. Sarah Bennett remained silent near the doorway, listening carefully as Grace continued her story. The delivery happened just after midnight, Grace said. You were strong and perfectly healthy. I remember the doctor saying so very clearly. Daniel felt something shift in his chest again, a strange combination of curiosity and something deeper that he could not yet name. And then what happened? He asked. Grace paused for a moment before answering, not because she was unsure, but because the memory itself seemed heavy. Your mother held you for several minutes, Grace said softly. She was smiling the entire time. Daniel's eyes lifted quickly, but I was told she died shortly after I was born. Grace nodded slowly. That is the story that was given to everyone. Daniel's gaze sharpened again. But you were saying that is not what happened. Grace took a quiet breath. The evening light had now faded enough that the chandelier above them began casting brighter reflections across the room. Her voice remained calm when she spoke again. No, sir, she said gently. That is not what happened at all. Daniel Whitmore held his gaze on Grace Coleman, searching her face for any sign that her words might be exaggerated or uncertain. Yet what he saw instead was something far more unsettling for a man who had built his life around clear facts and controllable outcomes. He saw calm memory, the quiet certainty of someone who had lived through the moment she described. The chandelier above them now cast a steady white light across the living room. reflecting softly against the marble floors and the tall windows that framed the darkening evening outside. Daniel spoke slowly, measuring each word. If that is not what happened, then explain what did. Grace nodded slightly as though she had expected that question from the beginning. She glanced briefly at the photograph on the glass table, then returned her eyes to Daniel. After you were born, your mother held you for several minutes, she said gently. She kept whispering the same thing. Daniel felt a quiet tension gather in his chest. What did she say? Grace answered without hesitation. She said you were perfect. The simplicity of the statement seemed to soften the room for a moment. Daniel looked down toward the photograph again. The woman's smile now carrying an entirely different meaning than it had only an hour earlier. Grace continued carefully. Your father arrived about 30 minutes later. Daniel's head lifted slightly. My father? Grace nodded. Yes, sir. He came directly to the maternity floor. I remember because the hospital administrator walked with him. That was unusual for that time of night. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. His father had always been a powerful and determined man. Someone who expected situations to unfold exactly the way he planned them. Grace continued her story with the same steady tone. When he entered the room, your mother tried to speak with him. She was holding you and smiling. But the conversation between them was quiet and tense. Daniel listened without interrupting now. The room remained silent except for Grace's voice and the faint ticking of the clock near the staircase. After several minutes, the doctor asked the staff to step outside the room. Grace said, most of us assumed they wanted privacy to discuss medical matters. But I stayed nearby because I was responsible for the infant monitoring station. Daniel folded his arms again, his mind beginning to piece together the fragments she described. And what happened next? He asked. Grace paused for a brief moment, as though replaying the memory clearly in her mind. About 20 minutes later the door opened, she said. Your father walked out carrying you. Daniel felt the quiet weight of the moment shift again. And my mother? Grace met his gaze directly. She was still alive, she said calmly. The words settled into the room with a quiet force that no one could ignore. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as the meaning of her statement became clear. Then how did the story change? He asked. Grace looked toward the photograph once more before answering. Because shortly after that, the hospital staff were told that your mother had passed away due to complications. Daniel felt a slow realization begin to form, a realization that reached beyond simple misunderstanding. You were telling me the hospital record was false. Grace spoke gently but firmly. Yes, sir. The room remained silent as Daniel Whitmore stood in the center of the living room, beginning to understand that the story he had accepted his entire life might not have been a tragedy at all, but something far more complicated and far more deliberate. Daniel Whitmore remained still after Grace Coleman finished speaking, the words echoing quietly in his mind. The hospital record was false. For most of his life, Daniel had believed facts were permanent, that documents and official records formed the backbone of truth. Yet the story Grace was describing suggested something far different. The chandelier light shimmered softly across the glass table where the photograph and letter rested, the image of the young woman now carrying a gravity Daniel could no longer dismiss. He slowly exhaled and looked toward Grace again. If the record was false, he said carefully, then someone had the authority to change it. Grace nodded gently. Yes, sir. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. And you believe that person was my father? Grace did not rush to answer. She seemed to understand that the conclusion was already forming in Daniel's mind without her needing to push it further. I believe he had influence, she said quietly. More influence than anyone else involved that night. The room fell silent again. Sarah Bennett stood quietly near the doorway, watching Daniel with the careful patience of someone who understood how difficult the truth could be to absorb. Daniel's thoughts moved quickly now, connecting fragments of memory he had never examined before. His father had always been a man who believed in control. Every detail of his business empire had been carefully shaped by his decisions. Every obstacle had been handled with decisive authority. Daniel remembered how hospital administrators and lawyers had often visited their home during his childhood, always speaking with quiet respect when his father entered the room. The possibility that his father could influence a hospital record was no longer difficult to imagine. Daniel spoke again, his voice steady but quieter. You said my mother was alive when my father left the room, carrying me. Grace nodded once more. Yes, sir. Daniel looked down briefly at the photograph, then back to Grace. Did you see her after that moment? Grace took a slow breath before answering. Yes, I did. Daniel's attention sharpened immediately. Then tell me exactly what happened. Grace glanced toward the window where the last traces of daylight had faded into evening. When she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but carried the weight of memory. About an hour later, I was asked to check on her room. The hallway was quiet because most of the maternity floor had settled for the night. When I entered the room, your mother was awake. She looked exhausted but relieved. Daniel felt his focus tighten around every word. Did she know I was gone? Grace nodded gently. Yes. She asked me where the baby was. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. What did you tell her? Grace answered softly. I told her the baby had been taken to the nursery for routine observation. The memory seemed to pause in Grace's mind before she continued. She smiled when she heard that. She said she could not wait to hold you again in the morning. Daniel remained completely still as the meaning of that sentence settled over him. Grace continued quietly. But the morning never came the way she expected. Daniel's voice lowered almost to a whisper. What do you mean? Grace looked directly at him. Because by the time the next shift began, the hospital staff had been informed that your mother had already been discharged during the night. The statement landed like a quiet thunderclap in the room. Daniel stared at her for a moment before speaking again. Discharged? Grace nodded slowly. Yes, sir. That was the official explanation. Daniel Whitmore looked once more at the photograph of the young woman who had once held him in a hospital room in Boston, and for the first time he understood that the story of his mother's death had not only been false. It had been carefully replaced with something far more convenient for the people who controlled the truth. Daniel Whitmore did not speak for several moments after Grace finished her explanation. The word discharged continued to echo quietly in his thoughts, sounding less like a medical term and more like a carefully chosen piece of a story that had been constructed around him his entire life. The mansion felt unusually still now. The evening outside had fully settled, and the soft glow of interior lighting replaced the fading daylight that had filled the room earlier. Daniel slowly walked toward the glass table where the photograph and letter rested. His movements were calm but deliberate, the way he moved when considering a decision that could alter the course of something important. He picked up the photograph again and looked at it with a new understanding forming behind his eyes. The young woman in the image no longer seemed like a distant stranger from a forgotten past. She now represented a life that had existed just beyond his reach for 38 years. Daniel turned the photograph slightly toward the chandelier light, studying the details once more. Then he looked back at Grace. If she was discharged during the night, he said slowly, then someone arranged that departure. Grace nodded gently. Yes, sir. Daniel's voice remained steady. Did you see who took her? Grace hesitated for a brief moment before answering. Not because she doubted the memory, but because she understood the significance of what she was about to say. 2 men arrived around 3 in the morning, she said. They were not hospital staff. They spoke with the administrator privately before entering the room. Daniel's expression sharpened. Did my father come with them? Grace shook her head slowly. No, sir. But the administrator spoke his name when he was explaining the situation to the nurse on duty. Daniel felt the quiet confirmation settle into place. The pieces of the story were no longer scattered fragments. They were beginning to form a pattern that was impossible to ignore. What happened when they entered the room? Daniel asked quietly. Grace kept her voice calm as she continued. They spoke with your mother for several minutes. I could not hear everything from the hallway, but I remember she looked confused at first. Then she became very quiet. Daniel's grip on the photograph tightened slightly, though his voice remained controlled. And then, Grace answered gently. Then she agreed to leave. Daniel lifted his eyes sharply. Agreed. Grace nodded. Yes, sir. She believed she was doing what was best for you. The room felt heavier now, as if the truth had begun to settle fully into the space between them. Daniel looked down again at the photograph and then at the letter lying beside it. For most of his life, he had believed his father's decisions were always meant to protect him and shape his future. Now he realized that one of those decisions had also erased a person from his life completely. Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter but carrying a new resolve. You said she waited years for me to learn the truth. Sarah Bennett nodded softly from near the doorway. Yes. Daniel placed the photograph carefully back onto the table. His eyes moved from the letter to the 2 women standing in front of him. Then the question is no longer whether the story was false, he said slowly. The question now is whether there is still time to correct it. The room remained silent as the meaning of those words settled over everyone present. And for the first time since the conversation began, Daniel Whitmore began to consider not just the truth about his past, but what he might still be able to do about it. Daniel Whitmore stood quietly beside the glass table, the weight of the moment settling deeper into the room. His eyes rested on the photograph for several seconds before he slowly picked up the letter again. The paper felt lighter than before, yet the meaning behind the words seemed heavier with every passing minute. Across the room, Grace Coleman remained still, her calm presence steady in the quiet space, while Sarah Bennett watched Daniel with the cautious patience of someone who understood that the next decision belonged only to him. Daniel unfolded the letter once more and read the lines that followed the portion he had seen earlier. My dear Daniel, if this letter reaches you, I hope it does not arrive too late. I never wanted your life to be filled with anger toward the people who raised you, because I believe they thought they were protecting something important. But I want you to know that not a single birthday passed without me wondering what kind of man you were becoming. Daniel paused while reading, his eyes briefly lifting toward the tall windows where the darkness outside had fully replaced the evening light. For years he had celebrated birthdays surrounded by business partners, friends, and success that few people could imagine. Yet the idea that somewhere in Boston another person had quietly marked those same days without him created a feeling he could not easily describe. He continued reading. I am proud of you even though I have only known you through stories and newspaper articles. When I see your name in the world, I recognize the same determination I saw in your eyes the night you were born. Daniel lowered the letter slightly. His voice came out softer than before when he spoke. She followed my life. Sarah nodded gently. Yes. She kept newspaper clippings and business magazines. She said she always wanted to understand the man you were becoming. Daniel folded the letter slowly and placed it back beside the photograph. For a long moment, he did not speak again. The quiet inside the Whitmore mansion seemed almost respectful now, as if the house itself recognized the importance of the truth that had finally reached its owner. Daniel turned toward Grace. You said she agreed to leave because she believed it was best for me. Grace nodded once. Yes, sir. Daniel considered that carefully. His father had built an empire by controlling outcomes and shaping circumstances to protect the future he wanted. For the first time, Daniel understood that one of those decisions had shaped his own life in ways he had never realized. He looked toward Sarah again. How long ago did she ask you to bring this letter to me? Sarah answered quietly. 3 weeks ago. Daniel's attention sharpened. 3 weeks. Sarah nodded again. She told me that if I was able to find you, I should give you the letter and the photograph. She said that was enough. She did not want to pressure you to see her if you did not want to. Daniel looked down at the photograph once more. The young woman's gentle smile carried a quiet patience that seemed almost timeless. For 38 years he had believed that smile belonged only to memory. Now he understood it belonged to someone who might still be waiting in Boston. Daniel finally straightened his posture and looked from Sarah to Grace. His voice was calm, but the decision inside it was unmistakable. If she waited all those years without asking anything from me, he said slowly, then the least I can do now is make sure she does not spend another day wondering if I will come. The room remained silent for a moment before Daniel Whitmore reached for his phone on the table, already beginning to consider the next step in a journey that should have begun decades earlier. Daniel Whitmore held the phone in his hand for a moment before dialing, his eyes drifting once more to the photograph on the glass table. The woman in the image no longer felt like a mystery from the past. She felt like someone whose life had quietly run parallel to his own for nearly 4 decades without ever crossing paths. The living room remained silent as he spoke a few calm instructions into the phone, arranging a private flight to Boston before ending the call. When he set the phone down, the decision already felt irreversible. For years Daniel had believed success meant controlling the future. Now he understood that sometimes the most important part of life was repairing the past. He looked toward Sarah Bennett. How far is the hospital from where she lives? Sarah answered softly. About 20 minutes outside the city. She lives in a small neighborhood near the Charles River. Daniel nodded slightly. The familiar name of the river stirred old memories again. Snow-covered sidewalks. Early mornings with pale winter sunlight. A childhood he had always believed began after loss, not separation. Grace Coleman watched him quietly, her calm expression unchanged, but Daniel noticed something gentle in her eyes now, something that looked almost like relief. "Grace," Daniel said after a moment. She straightened slightly. "Yes, sir." Daniel studied her with the same careful attention he had given the photograph earlier. "You carried this memory for 38 years. Grace lowered her gaze modestly. "It was not my place to interfere, sir. At least that is what I believed for a long time." Daniel shook his head slowly. "Today you stepped forward anyway." Grace answered simply, "Because sometimes silence lasts too long." Daniel looked at her for another moment, understanding that the truth he had just discovered would never have reached him without her quiet courage. For 12 years she had walked through the halls of his home unnoticed, yet today she had changed the direction of his life with a few carefully spoken words. Daniel glanced again toward the photograph and the letter resting beside it. The soft smile of the young woman seemed almost alive in the warm light of the chandelier. "When we land in Boston," Daniel said calmly, "I want you both with me." Sarah blinked slightly in surprise. "You want us to come?" Daniel nodded. "You helped bring the truth to my door. It would be wrong to leave you behind when I finally walk through the next one." Grace did not respond immediately, but the quiet gratitude in her expression said enough. Outside the tall windows the night had fully settled across the Whitmore estate, the distant trees barely visible under the faint glow of the ground's lights. Inside the mansion the photograph remained on the table, no longer just a piece of evidence, but the beginning of a reunion that had waited nearly 4 decades to happen. Daniel Whitmore looked at it one last time before turning toward the hallway to prepare for the journey ahead. For most of his life, he had believed his mother was a memory that ended the night he was born. Now he understood something far more powerful. She had not disappeared from his story. She had simply been waiting, patiently and quietly, for the moment when the truth would finally find its way back to her son.